Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fall 2017 ISJIE public event. Thank you all for coming, and yes, it's hot and humid in here, and that's just how it's going to be. So, my name is Dr. Jerusha Lamte, and I'm a professor here of Islam and Interreligious Engagement, and I'm also the director of the Islam Social Justice and Interreligious Engagement Program, ISJIE for short. We have a fabulous program for tonight, so we want to get to that. But before we do, I want to make just a few announcements. The first is that bathrooms are that way. That's a really important announcement. Bathrooms and water fountains. The other is that we have a prayer space here at Union. So for those of you who are looking for a prayer space for Maghrib, we will probably continue the program going, but we will be in the Q&A phase of the program by that time, and you should feel free to go and use the prayer space. Just follow the signs out that door, and when you get to the scary looking, you think you ran into the mechanical room, you're going the right way. Okay, just follow the signs. I think I almost wrote on one of them, yes, this way, really. So follow them, and you take the elevator up to the 6th floor, and there's a prayer space up there. Let me see if there's any other, there's one very important logistical item, which is that we have copies of Dr. Abdul Khabeer's book in the back. They're $20 in cash or a check. And if you purchase one, she's here, so she'll sign it, but also you get a really cool button. So there's added incentive. And so those copies are in the back, and you can do that towards the end. Let me tell you a little bit about ISJIE and a little bit about some other programs that are coming up. As many of you may know, ISJIE is a program here at Union Theological Seminary that does both public educational programs and academic programs. The main thrust of our work is to try to incubate innovative thought around Islam, social justice issues, and in interreligious conversations. So the issues can range from racism to poverty to ecology to gender to sexuality. And so what we try to do in our public programming and in our academic programs is bring people here to think together and to develop rooted yet innovative approaches to the Islamic tradition, and to do that from the get-go in conversation with people from other backgrounds, because contextually we live in a context where we work with and live with and often love with people from other backgrounds. Okay, it's a little bit about ISJIE. There's some cards in the back, so I'm not going to go on. ISJIE has all of our online connection stuff, so you can learn more about us there and also on the Union website. Just two other brief things. One is that we have an annual Muslim Women Leaders program, and the application for that is currently open. It's for Muslim women who identify as leaders either in religious communities, educational contexts, academic contexts, organizing contexts. We have some people who have participated in that program last year here, so if you want a first-hand account, hopefully it will be positive. But that takes place in January, and application is open now. We bring people to New York City. We work together for 3 days. It's quite an intense and fabulous experience. Okay? And then last announcement, informational piece. This year, Union launched an MDiv degree in Islam and Interreligious Engagement. What that means, an MDiv degree is a 3-year degree. We have a master's degree and a PhD program as well, but the 3-year degree is geared specifically towards people who are looking to work in and with Muslim communities. But there's 3 distinctive features about this program. One is it's deeply rooted in Islamic sciences, so learning those skills and about the tradition. The second is that you will also learn about other traditions and learn in conversation with those traditions. And then the third feature is that the whole basis of the program is, again, looking at questions of social disparity and social justice issues. So the intention of the program is to produce leaders and people who work in communities who have critical lenses about topics such as gender and race and poverty and ecology, and are aware of what other communities are doing, not so that we can replicate that, but so that we can be informed of it and in conversation with it. Okay? that's all of my directorial responsibilities. So now I get to do the fun part, and that is to introduce our guest. I'm going to read her bio and then turn it over to her. Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer is a scholar, artist, activist who uses anthropology and performance to explore the intersections of race and popular culture. Her latest work, which is the book in the back, Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States, available from the NYU Press, is an ethnography on Islam and hip hop that examines how intersecting ideas of Muslim-ness and Blackness challenge and reproduce meanings of race in the United States. Suad's written work is accompanied by her one-woman solo performance, sampled Beats of Muslim Life. Suad also leads Sapalo Square, the first website to comprehensively document and analyze the Black U.S. American Muslim experience. Suad has written for The Root, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Ebony Magazine, The Huffington Post, and Religious Dispatches, and appeared on Al Jazeera English. She received her PhD from Princeton University and is currently Associate Professor of American Culture and Arab and Muslim American Studies at the University of Michigan. And with that, I turn the program over to her. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abdul Khabeer.
Good evening. I greet you with universal greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. I'm honored to be here today and share some of my thoughts at this renowned institution. I thank Dr. Jerusalemti, Ali Saeed, and everyone at ISJIE and here at Union Theological Seminary for honoring me with this invitation. It's also kind of nice to be close to home. I grew up on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge in Crown Heights. It's a bit bittersweet, of course, bitter because you can't go home again, and literally because they're gentrifying Brooklyn. And sweet, though, because no matter what they do, they can't really erase us. So I begin my brief remarks today in the name of Allah, for the love of Muhammad, in honor of the ancestors, and in celebration of my people. And as the descendant of stolen people on stolen land, I also begin by acknowledging that the land upon which we gather is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape people, and that some of us are uninvited guests. And since we are commemorating the month of Muharram in the Islamic calendar, I also begin by acknowledging that every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. So when I was thinking about tonight, I had this idea. I was like, maybe I should have them play this song on my entrance, or like play it at the beginning. And the song in my head was the song Stakes is High by the hip hop group De La Soul. And I thought of the song because, well, I'm a hip hop head, and so there's a hip hop track for every moment of my life, but also because of the weightiness of the topics I was asked to speak on tonight: Muslims, Black Lives Matter, and race in America. And if you don't know De La, you don't know Stakes is High, this song is a great song that really kind of enumerates, what the stakes are, right? For people of color, for people of African descent, for the hip hop community, for young people. And, it really fits because I think stakes are really high for us. And what's at stake for us in this moment is sort of our existence as a species, but also as souls. And so there are 3 points that I kind of pulled together that I wanted to talk about today. Now, I want to preface this by saying, when I thought about this topic, I thought about things that I've been noticing around these 3 terms: Muslims, Black Lives Matter, and race in America, particularly within the Muslim community in the United States, but also in how that Muslim community is kind of connected to or not broader community conversations around these same topics. And so the 3 points that I have are really kind of speaking in that way. So the first point I'm going to address is social justice as a Black Muslim moral virtue. The second point that I want to talk about is the relationship between intersectionality and critical racial analysis and prophetic tradition. And the third point I want to kind of talk about is allies or accomplices in the erasure of Black Muslims. So this is where we're going to go to tonight. And so hopefully you'll follow along with me. So the first point, social justice as a Black Muslim moral virtue. So, since I've been doing the work that I've been doing, people have kind of asked me, what inspires you to sort of be concerned about questions of justice? And I respond in other words, but sort of like, I get it from my mama, right? This is kind of what I say. And my mother, Abdul Khabeer, who I think is on her way here, she, like many in her generation, was attracted to Islam because of the ways in which Black Muslims linked themselves to the Black radical tradition. And before she became Muslim, she was an African nationalist, she was a Black Panther. And so when I talked to her about her experience, she says, well, Islam gave me a way to stay connected to sort of Black struggle, but also gave me frameworks for family and spirituality, things that were really important to her. And if we fast forward about 20 years later, my husband, who is also a convert to Islam, although he converted before we met, he, like my mother, was also attracted to Islam because of the ways in which Black Muslims linked themselves to the Black radical tradition. Of course, for him, that was through hip-hop music and culture. And I talk about this actually in my book, this idea of knowledge of self being kind of hip-hop's ethical core and being something that hip-hop sort of got from Black Islam. Knowledge of self refers to sort of what it sounds like, knowing who you are, which entails sort of knowing your past so you can interpret your present, and you can use that knowledge of self to sort of enact change in the world, right? And so this is sort of a core hip-hop ethic that comes from what I call Black Islam. And Black Islam is a term that I use to describe the various different ways Black people in the United States have engaged Muslim tradition, and which are diverse, but they're connected because they have this unwavering commitment to Black liberation. And so for me then, when I talk about social justice as a Black Muslim moral virtue, what I'm saying is that this idea that your faith and your activism, there's a synergy between the two, right? That there is this sort of two sides of the same coin, that they kind of flow from the same river, right? That there's this really deep interconnectedness between what it means to be a person of faith, to be a Muslim, and what it means to be connected to, concerned about, right, the lives and the outcomes and the futures of Black people, right? And all people, because, when we get free, everybody gets free, right? So, but one of the things, and so this is where I said, okay, where am I going with this? So, but one of the things that I've kind of noticed when I kind of look out in sort of social media land or in speeches by Muslims, lay Muslims, prominent Muslims, is a kind of, I don't know if it's a backlash or maybe a critique of this kind of synergy in the name of morality or virtue. And specifically, and this goes to the most Black Lives Matter piece of it, I find that people are resistant, to put it nicely, dismissal, to put it more realistically, to put it more realistically, of sort of the organization Black Lives Matter, but also the overall movement for Black lives because of their concerns around issues of gender identity and sexuality. So specifically the ways in which Black Lives Matter and this kind of general movement is queer affirming and is sort of arguing for a respect and acknowledgement of sort of transgender lives, right? And so, so the dismissal of the movement as a whole, right, in the name of morality and virtue. And frankly, I'm perplexed, right? So I'm perplexed because I don't understand exactly how these issues, right, became the ones on which we draw lines in the sand. Like, this is kind of what I'm perplexed about. I'm perplexed because it seems to me that piety, to be pious, is being reduced to a very selective universe of concerns, right? Sexuality up and above state violence. Gender normativity up and above systemic inequality, poverty, all these things, right? And I'm perplexed because as a result of that, it seems like this synergy that I grew up with, right, that my mother had, that my husband had, right, my mother has, the synergy I grew up is kind of being bracketed out of what it means to be a pious Muslim, which ironically, of course, is very secular And for those, and what I mean by that is that one of the things we know about secularism, right, is that it sort of asks us to bracket out faith and spirituality, make it private, make it individual, put it over here, right? And it only looks and does certain kinds of things, right? And so this kind of, oh, we can't deal with those people because they're into this thing, because of our piety, is a similar type of move, even though the folks who typically make that move are railing against secularism, right? So that's just a side note. So anyway, right? And so I'm perplexed by this, also because one of the things that Muslims do is that we call upon or we invoke pious ancestors as a way to guide our behavior. And one of the probably most popularly invoked pious ancestor in the U.S. context that people invoke is Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And I call him a pious ancestor because he was martyred, right, in the Muslim tradition, that is a status, right, that's a sort of a noble status. I also call him a pious ancestor. People have referred to him as a wali, which is sort of the Arabic term for saint, to talk to really, because what people are trying to do is talk about his impact, right, and his virtue, and the way he operates as kind of a moral guide, even in his passing. So I thought about him, and this website that she mentioned that I run, Sapelo Square, we did a three-part piece, sort of inspired by the ballot or the bullet, right? And I remember when I read this in the speech when I was preparing that. So in his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, in 1964, so this is post after he's left the Nation of Islam. So he says, I'm quoting him here, I'm still a Muslim. Although I'm still a Muslim, I'm not here tonight to discuss my religion. I'm not here to try and change your religion. I'm not here to argue or discuss anything we differ about, because it's time for us to submerge our differences and realize that it's best for us to first see that we have the same problem, a common problem, a problem that will make you catch hell, whether you're a Baptist or a Methodist or a Muslim or a nationalist, whether you're educated or illiterate, whether you live on the boulevard or in the alley. You're going to catch hell just like I am. We're all in the same boat, and we're all going to catch the same hell from the same man. He just happens to be a white man. All of us have suffered here in this country, political oppression at the hands of the white man, economic exploitation at the hands of the white man, and social degradation at the hands of the white man. So I invoke sort of this, so our pious ancestor, right? And I'm looking at what he's offering, or what he's offering as a model. And I think what's really key here is that he's identifying that we have difference, yes, right? We are not going to agree on everything. You know, that's just the way it's going to be. And for some, and I want to acknowledge that for some, questions of gender sexuality are important. I'm not saying they're not important, that you shouldn't consider them at all, like they're not important. But my question is, how important really? Right, when it comes to the hell we're all catching, how important really is this to draw lines in the sand, right? And what does Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, what does his model suggest for us in terms of thinking about how we deal with difference? I had a conversation with some folks about similar issues, and we're in an interfaith space, so I'm gonna try to say this as delicately as possible, right? But one of the things that I said to people, is like, spaces like this emerge because Muslims identify the need to work with people across difference, which means for Muslims working with people across the difference of tawheed, right? So tawheed is this notion of the oneness of God. Like, this is the thing that all Muslim belief completely founds itself upon, right? But Muslims will work with people of other religious traditions whose belief system completely and totally contradicts tawheed without thinking about it. Okay, right? We got that, we'll figure it out. But yet, so someone said this to me, she's like, yeah, she's like, when people ask me, like, how do you work with Catholic Muslims? Ask me, how do you work with Catholics? How do you work with these people? She's like, I have my answers. But when it comes to this gender and sexuality issue, I'm pausing, right? And my question is that really, is this something that is so significant that we can't find a way to work together around, and why is this issue become the issue, right? Because while we have difference, right, and while we have difference on these points, what we share seems to me to be much more greater, right? And this question of Black Lives Matter, and this question of state violence, and the question of the system, Ruthie Gilmore, she's at University of California, Berkeley. She defines racism, right, as this vulnerability to premature death, right? So the rates at which Black people are vulnerable to premature death, right? I'm sorry, I'm perplexed, right? That's how I began, right? How is it, like, what I'm suggesting is that the Muslim community, and particularly the Black Muslim community, needs to reconsider, right, which issues become the issues to draw lines in the sand when we're all vulnerable to death, right? When we're all subjected to this state violence. Not that you have to ignore your difference, not that you have to not say there is no difference, but I think we have to find that what we share, right, is a much greater, a greater motivator, right, in the model, right, of our pious ancestor, Malcolm X. And because, of course, stakes are high. And the last thing I want to say on this point in particular is one of my colleagues and friends, Donna Austin, we were talking about this issue. And she's like, I don't get it. She's like, we're like Marcus Garvey's babies, right? And what she's talking about is the way in which kind of Black Muslim experience is framed by the Black radical tradition, someone like Marcus Garvey, right? So how is it that we have this tradition that in many ways, I guess I'm saying, I feel like it's almost throwing away your inheritance, right? You've inherited a tradition of really being concerned about and engaged in responding to the deep conditions of Black people. Like this is what I know I inherited. This is what my mother taught me. This is what my family taught me. This is what my community taught me, right? And so at what point do you sort of just throw that away under the auspices of these narrow notions of morality and piety, and rather recognizing that, in fact, that inheritance is an act of morality and virtue and piety. Second point. So Malcolm does say we all catch the same hell, which is true, but should be amended a little bit, right? And this brings me to the point of intersectionality, right, and this idea of critical race studies. So a critical analysis of race and racial inequality. So, I think most people may have heard of intersectionality, right? It's this concept developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar, that describes the way different parts of who we are, like race, gender, and class, intersect, that make our experience of the world related and distinct. So, for example, all Muslim women are subjected to sexism, right? But only Black Muslim women are going to be subjected to sexism and anti-Black racism, right? Because of race and gender, the intersection. Now, while Crenshaw developed this term, right, she did not create the experience. So, for example, Sojourner Truth's famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, is like classic intersectionality, right? But it precedes Crenshaw by at least 100 years. But we cite Crenshaw, why? Because, and she acknowledges this herself, right? She gave us a language for it, right? You know what it is, you're experiencing it, but she gave us a way to name it. And one of the things, so my question is, what is the relationship between this idea of intersectionality and the prophetic tradition? And I'm thinking about this, and I'm like, wait a minute. When I was a kid, I was taught that if someone stole a piece of bread, but they were hungry, the punishment that would normally be weighted upon someone who was a thief was lifted. I was like, oh my goodness, that's intersectionality, right? Because what it's doing is identifying that your social location matters, right? How you're positioned, right, shapes what kind of opportunities you have, what you don't have, how you see the world, you have access to, what you don't. And that in order for us to then deal with you in society, right, and deal with you justly in society, we have to have recognition of how these things intersect, right? So in this case, poverty, right, intersecting sort of the poor person being different than the wealthy person who robs, for example, right? That meaning something. And so when I thought about it, I was like, what's so dynamic about that then to me is that then intersectionality, right, which is a sort of, the term itself is sort of contemporary, although the concept clearly is much older, but having an intersectional way of viewing the world, intersectional analysis, that then becomes a way to actually embrace prophetic tradition. Because then what it does is it gives you the same sort of critical lens to understand how we should be treating each other, how we should be understanding each other, what are our responsibilities to each other, what kind of privileges do I have, what kind of disadvantages do I have, and how those things, how they operate together, and what are our responsibilities. And this reminds me, and I was thinking about who I want to cite, because citations are so important, right? And under this point of intersectionality in particular, and racial analysis, right? And the importance of having a critical racial analysis to your understanding of your faith and your responsibilities as a Muslim. And so two scholars that I deeply admire, and that I think I can call sort of mentors of sorts, they come to mind. So the first, some of you may know of him, is Sherman Jackson. And Dr. Sherman Jackson, he's at USC, right? He has this argument about white supremacy as a modern form of shirk. And shirk is a term, can be translated as idolatry, really, in which it's sort of, you talked about Tawheed and the importance of Tawheed. So shirk is this idea of denying God's oneness and incomparability, right? So he argues that white supremacy, right, it advances these ideas of white people as normal and regular and the ideal, and then racial hierarchies, right, so everyone else as less than, right, in which the kind of loyalty that you're supposed to have to God, this one God, is actually misplaced. And it's misplaced onto people who are raised as white, right? And this is a transgression, which is why he's like, it's shirk, right? Now, but follow what he's doing here, right? This is a critical, analysis of race, right? This is saying, in order for, because shirk is a concept that exists in Muslim tradition and can have many different faces, right? But in this context, in this moment, what does shirk look like? And how does our critical analysis of race, right, play a role in that? Similarly, right, another one of my admired and mentors, Dr. Amina Wadud, she makes a similar argument around patriarchy, right? She says that patriarchy pushes these notions of men as normal and ideal, and gender hierarchies, right, in which men and women are different, and the difference is a deficiency, right? So men are better than women, right? In which the loyalty that belongs to God is misplaced onto human beings and human systems that are gendered male. Now, I know this is hard for some people to swallow, right, because of their investments in patriarchy. Nevertheless, the logic holds, right? And there's this interplay. So I mentioned both of those things in this question of intersectionality and racial analysis because, Malcolm said we're all catching the same hell. Well, he's right. But if you're black and you're a woman, your hell is a little bit different than if you're a black man, for example, right? And likewise, and that kind of difference is important to understand because there really is this sort of interplay, right, between patriarchy and white supremacy, capitalism and imperialism, right, these what Bell Hooks calls these interlocking systems of oppression, right, that are shaping our realities and are shaping what we have access to and what we don't. And therefore is shaping our spiritual identities as well and our spiritual practice, right? If we don't have a clear understanding of the forces of oppression that we live under, how can we then, right, fully embody and actualize, right, social justice as this moral virtue? How can we do that if we don't know? If we can't name it, if we can't understand it, then we can't do anything about it. And if we're not, and there's no Switzerland when it comes to oppression, right? You're either working against it or you're supporting it. There's no two ways around it, right? So then this question becomes, right, so you have to understand what it is that you're experiencing, what is going on around you in order to do something about it. And you have to do something about it because this is your spiritual imperative. This is your job, right, as a human being, as God's creation. Now, one last thing I want to say about that point, I think, is that I was talking to a good friend, but I'm not going to name him because we didn't talk about this first. I won't name him yet. But I was talking to a good friend about these ideas I was preparing to share today. And he was saying, because there is a discourse that's emerging in which there are Muslims who are saying, this white privilege stuff. For example, I tweeted, someone interviewed me about an article about the Emmys. Yeah, that's what it was. And they interviewed me about what they saw was a disparage between Muslim celebration of Black versus non-Black Muslim artists who won Emmys, right? And so I made the claim in the article. The author was saying Mahershala Ali, he won, well, not an Emmy, but in terms of just, not Emmys, but winning awards, like in popular culture. So the author was saying, you know, she didn't feel like she saw as much excitement when Mahershala Ali won the Oscar, as opposed to when these other people, I think Aziz Ansari and someone else won an Emmy, and they don't even identify as Muslim, really. She's like, they have Muslim parents, but they don't really identify as Muslim. And so she was like, you know, well, Mahershala Ali is Ahmadi, so that could be part of it. And I was like, I don't think it's just that he's Ahmadi. I also think part of it is because he's Black. So that's the backstory. The front story is on Twitter, so this guy tweets at me, and he's like, how is that possible? And I'm like, well, race is central to everything in the United States. And he's like, that's an extremist position. I'm like, really? I'm like, I'm sorry. It's like, here's some syllabi, get your weight up, and then we can have a conversation, right? But seriously, right? So this idea that talking about these things are extremist positions, and I think, so my friend was suggesting that it has something to do with people's sort of wanting to have some sort of proximity to whiteness, right? Whether it's kind of sort of through the privilege or even the people that they know who are white, and they're gonna be uncomfortable. Like the white Muslim will be uncomfortable we're talking about white privilege all the time. It's like, okay, but you know what's really uncomfortable? Not knowing if your loved one's gonna come home because they might get killed by the police. I'm like, that's really uncomfortable. So if some people who have privilege in our society have some sort of discomfort because we're asking them to acknowledge it and then become our accomplices in dismantling it, I'm okay with that. I'm good, you know? But I make this point because I think, again, these ideas and this analysis is important. And it's important to sort of understanding not just what's happening, but also understanding what's happening, I think, in terms of faith and spirituality, right, which is kind of why we're here tonight. And so the last point I wanted to make, and then I'll conclude, because I think I'm checking my time, so I'm good, okay? You're not checking it, she's like, I don't know what time it is, right? No, is this question of accomplices or allies and the erasure of Black Muslims. So I said I was gonna talk about this. So I'm like, you know, I guess I'm not young anymore. I thought I was, but I guess I'm not. But in any event, I tweeted about this event, right? And so people, I don't know if people are familiar with Twitter. One of the things I think you're supposed to do is I tweeted sort of like, hey, I'm having this talk, come join me. And then I say and a bunch of people like, hey you, come join me, right? And then I attached the photo of the event, the flyer that you must have seen. And so I did that in collections of people that I think together in the similar ways. So there was one group particular that I did, in which, so I said, hey, come join me. And of that group, I think 3 of the people they were all Muslim, but not Black. And people misread it, and they were like, oh my God, they're having a panel on race, Muslims, and Black Lives Matter, and there's 1 or 2 Black people on it? What's up with that? That's bananas. It would be bananas. That would be bananas, right? That's not what was happening here. But that's how people responded. And so one of the things I thought, and I wanted to address it because I thought it's really important, because while, reading is fundamental and all that, I think that I think that the gut reaction was actually not very unreasonable, right? I think it was unreasonable because one of the other things that I've noticed, right, as I kind of look at what's happening within and outside the Muslim community, is that in this movement work around Black life, right, so we finally at a space, I think, where we might find that non-Black Muslims are willing to identify or recognize the vulnerability to premature death that Black people experience. Yet, at the same time, right, the question is, so what role are you supposed to play in that? And what happens if non-Black Muslims end up becoming spokespeople for Muslim communities on Black issues? Because this is the complaint they're having. This is where that comes from. So no, this event wasn't that. It's just me talking, sorry, and there's no other people here, right? But I get why they were because they have seen it before, right? And so, and this kind of elevation of non-Black Muslims to speak about Black issues is not only an internal Muslim problem, right? I think it's also something that we see stemming from sort of non-Muslim allies working with Muslim issues, right? So we have things like when people, so non-Muslim, so when the non-Muslim sort of community wants to find a Muslim to talk about something, and they skip over all the Black Muslims to get somebody else, right? And this is important. Why? Because the Black Muslim is the link, like the embodied link, right, between something like Black Lives Matter and the Muslim community, right? So this jumping over them, right, or jumping over us or me or whatever, right, like for these other people is deeply problematic, right? And it's deeply problematic because it also then, I think, speaks to ways in which then we're actually not undoing sort of the anti-Blackness that we see in our societies and our communities. Because part of the reason why I think that the non-Black Muslim might be elevated in these positions is because for the non-Muslim community, the Muslim isn't Black. So they're like, why would I ask her? Right? It's like, I'm supposed to ask this person because that's the Muslim, right? And then the question is, so then if that's our reality, if our reality is that Black Muslims are rendered invisible because they're not brown, quote unquote, then what is the responsibility of non-Black Muslims in movement work, right? And what is the responsibility of non-Muslim organizers in this work, right? To not continue to sort of marginalize and bracket out the very people who embody the link between between these worlds, the very people who embody this tradition of social justice as a moral virtue, right? The very people who embody intersectionality and critical analysis. I mean, this is who Black Muslims are, right? And so when that happens, so there's responsibilities on both sides. And so my suggestion tonight is to think about, well, what is that responsibility? What should that look like? What do we want that to look like, right? What do we want this to look like? So the last point I'm gonna make, because I have 20 seconds based on what they told me, is to conclude on this point I've been thinking about as well, that liberation is a journey and not a destination. And, I think, and I actually want to credit, citations again, I want to credit ISJIE Shakir for making me think about this. So one of the things that, as a speech he gave a long, long time ago that my husband plays over and over again because he really loves it, right? And one of the points that ISJIE Shakir makes is that, when it comes to sort of the quest for freedom and liberation, you can feel defeated, right? Because you're gonna do all this stuff and it ain't gonna work. It's just not, right? And he suggests, right, part of that is because you think you can make it work. And you're sort of forgetting the role of God, right, in sort of human affairs, right? This is his suggestion, right? And I thought about that. And I was like, yeah, because, it's like, I think even my mother used to say this, well, they don't get it now, they get it in the next life, this kind of thing, right? But I was thinking about that, and I was like, yeah, I get that, right? And I get how, the importance to never forget, right, how we are related to the divine, right? And that we are humans, we do what we can, but we don't really have control. And so when liberation is a journey, but that doesn't mean we cannot try to live out what we want this liberation to be, right? So it's like, okay, so we're not going to get there because this world's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. We're going to be fighting the good fight till Yom Kiyama, right? To the end of times, right? That's keep it 100. But while we're fighting that fight, shouldn't we fight that fight in a way in which we respect each other, or which we recognize how how we're affected differently based on how we're positioned under this system of oppression? Shouldn't we, we talk, one of the things people say, Prophet Muhammad said is that he was sent to perfect good character, right? So shouldn't then our journey towards liberation, should we be perfecting our good character? And that perfection of good character can include what you wear and how you talk to people who you associate with, but it must also include social justice and your activism. How are you going to do your part in reducing someone's vulnerability to premature death? How are you going to do your part into reducing state violence? How are you going to do your part into sort of dismantling economic exploitation, right? What did Malcolm say, right? He said political oppression, economic exploitation, social degradation. How are you going to do your part? And then your perfection of your character has to include that, right? So that your faith and your activism, right? Piety is expansive. You know, one of the things they also taught me as a child was that if you say Bismillah before you do something, it becomes an act of worship, right? In the name of God, you know? The world is all these ways in which piety is really expansive. Being a pious and a good Muslim is really expansive, and it does not bracket out, right, these broader issues of social justice and inequality that are a responsibility for us to respond to. So I'm going to end there, because I think we're also getting to Maghrib. So like they said, the room is not big enough, so like people can go in waves, and we'll do, I think, a Q&A now? Yeah, okay, now. No, but not yet. We'll start first. Hey, it's warm in here.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to do my other directorial responsibility, and that is to strongly encourage all of you to ask a question. And if there's a comment in that question, that's fine, but also to be as succinct as possible so that we can get to as many people as possible. I'm just purely going to call on people so that Dr. Abdul Khabeer does not have to keep an eye on the whole room. And then there are volunteers going around with a microphone. Since we're recording, please wait till you get the microphone in order to ask your question so that we have the question on sound as well. Okay? Sounds good? Okay, great. So,
Assalamu alaikum, sister.
Welcome, son.
My question is about, I guess, like the intersections of being a convert and also being black. And so I feel like there's very rich history. I mean, there is a very rich history there. But then there's also the feeling that Islam, it doesn't belong to you because of being a convert and because of how it's framed. So I wanted to know if you had any advice for how to navigate that space.
Yeah, sure. So I think, so this idea of, one of the things I talk about in my work too is the ways in which how anti-blackness functions in Muslim communities, such that black Muslim practice is sort of always and already suspect, right? There's a way in which how black Muslims do Islam, right? Even the continental Africans, right? So I'm like, right, how they do Islam is already kind of suspect, like religiously, okay, well, let's see. And part of that, so this convergence, anti-blackness, and so this question of being a convert that she's talking about sort of comes out of that too, right? Because if you're a convert, you're new to a religious tradition, and so you don't know as much. I mean, that's a kind of a general rule, right? But not so much in the US of A, right? Because, we have generations of people who are black Muslims, right? And so one to her question is that there's a way in which you're presumed to be a convert already, so which means you're presumed to not know. So that's one thing, right? So someone Muslim like 75 years, someone's like, when did you come Islam? You're just like, really? How does that work, right? So you have that kind of thing. And then you have that, but I think, so that's one issue. The other issue about just being a convert in general, right, is that, this idea that kind of you're new to the faith, so I have to teach you, even though I might not really know, right? Because because that happens. I don't really know, but I guess I know more than you, right? And it's ironic because, again, speaking of pious ancestors, right? It's like all of the pious ancestors, and when I say, and I'm talking about Prophet Muhammad's time, all of them are converts, right? Like, I mean, literally, all of them, right? And like Aisha or Fatima were like me, the children of converts, right? And so it was deeply ironic that conversion becomes this kind of second-class citizenship as opposed to potentially a really ennobled status, right? Because you are like our pious ancestors. So advice, okay. So I think one, so one of the things when I think about, again, my mother's experience or the experience of her generation is that I think that what I think from my vantage point is that what you had were people who had converted to Islam who were together, right? They were learning together, they were growing together, and they were supporting each other, right? And I think that is really key. I think it's really key to sort of build those relationships of support with people who share that experience, right? Who are also sort of, because for some converts it is new, like I'm learning how to do stuff new, right? And I need to figure it out. And I need to figure it out in a way that, because it makes sense to my reality, right? So I think one is that, right? I think so that's one way. I think the other way, so one is to have that kind of support network of other people who share that experience. I think also, you know, continue to learn, because that's important, right? And recognizing sort of, you know, we're all learning, you know, sort of in terms of as being Muslims. Some of us know more than others. Recognizing your limitations and continuing to learn, and then you really have to kind of just ignore people when it comes to the kind of like, you know, you just have to say, okay, thank you, great, I'm good, you know. It's like, you should pray, no, okay, I got you, you know, because people do that. You should pray this way, you should do that, you should, you know. Okay, I thank you for the information, take it under advisement, and keep it moving, right? Because you can't really, yeah, so that's all I'll say to that. Okay. Like my phone? I don't know.
Is now. Again, Assalamu alaikum, sister. I read parts of your book last year. I'm not going to lie and say I read it all, but like that's my attention span these days. So I just a question and a comment, if I may. The comment being, as someone who grew up Orthodox Muslim and who's also Arab, you know, the assumption, of course, those being one and the same, and of course they're not always. In any event, I want to just sort of say there is this anti-blackness, but I would say it's because of a modern history of anti-blackness that a lot of immigrants learn here in the U.S. I mean, we have colorism beforehand, but like this like disgusting like extra form of racism here in the U.S. You know, you can disagree with me. I don't care. Not you. I care, but the rest of you I don't. I'm not a student here. But anyways, so that said, I want to also say that because white converts are treated the exact opposite in my experience, both in queer Muslim spaces, I'm queer, identify queer, and particularly in this post 9/11 thing, we put like these, not me for sure, but we put white convert Muslims on this pedestal. Right, and it took me a while to figure out that it comes from the same place as anti-blackness. It's like our own inferiority complex, right, and putting whiteness at the center. So I want to say to you, but maybe respectfully, maybe it's a little more complicated, right, than that. It's our own internal, own being Arab and Muslim, first generation American, and first generation queer. So that was funny, guys. But anyway, so I'm sorry. I'll finish. So that said, I just another sort of way to think about it. But then my question to you is, well, and also we're all converts, right? Or we're all Muslim, depending on who you talk to. So literally, right? And the notion that you choose Islam even when you've been taught Islam. At least that's how I was raised, that I still had to choose it, if you will. I was lucky enough, blessed enough, cursed enough, depending on the day, to accept that. So I just want to thank you for that. Thank you for putting it out there and for not making it look like dirty laundry, because I think so often Muslims have this conversation, but only among Muslims. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess in terms of one thing I'll say about the race anti-blackness part. So I agree that there's a kind of convergence of what anti-blackness looks like in the United States and what that looks like coming from elsewhere. Right, there's this really great book Edward Curtis has called The Call of Bilal, and he talks about, one of the things he talks about is the way, because even the term, like, so in Arabic, right, or not Arabic, but in some sort of Arabic language in some places, right, the term abid, right, which is slave, is used for black person. Right, so it's like akin to sort of like an N-word sort of situation, right? And that's because of this association, like this historical association between slavery and black people, right? That predates, right, even predates like colonialism, right? So there's a kind of a history of that there, and it's complicated, right? Because it's complicated. I mean, it's really complicated, right? But then it also comes here. So this kind of convergence of these things happen. So so I think there's a kind of a historical background, and then there's this sort of historical background, and then there's what happens here, and then there's also the ways in which kind of, like I think what you're referring to two different forms of internalized racism, right? So kind of sort of how we view ourselves via whiteness or not, right? And then how we then interact with other people. But the white Muslim thing is kind of interesting. I'm still trying to figure this out myself because, so there's this theory that I like to teach. I've been teaching a couple classes in like Muslim spaces recently. And so Claire Jean Kim is a sociologist, and she has this theory she calls racial triangulation. And basically her theory, what she's saying is that we tend to think about race as kind of like up and down. Black people on the bottom, white people in the middle, and everybody else kind of falls in between. And she's like, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. And so she uses the example of, she compares, because basically, race and racial privilege and these things are contingent, they're relational. So basically she puts sort of Asian Americans, Black Americans, and white Americans, and she's comparing all of them, right? And one of the things she's saying is that Asian Americans have relative privilege vis-a-vis Black Americans because they're seen as a model minority, right? We've seen that before. But she says Black Americans have relative privilege vis-a-vis Asian Americans because Asian Americans are seen as always foreign, like always foreign, can never be assimilated, they're always foreign people, right? People that, like they just got here all the time, right? And then she says, and the whole point of this, right, is to maintain the status quo of white privilege, right? Because white people are going to be the most model and the most kind of belonging all the time, right? This is her point. So the example I do is let's take this into the Muslim community, right? And how would we triangulate? Like who would be the people who have privilege versus other people, right? And so the white Muslim is the one people cannot figure out what they want to do. So some people are like, there's like Hamza Youssef and Suhaib Webb and all these people who are these white men who are, heralded in the community, right? But other people are like, yeah, but I'm a white woman and people think I became Muslim because like my husband was Muslim. And they sort of dismiss my religiosity all the time. They're like, I'm not even real, right? So I don't know, I don't have answers to that, right? But I think it's a really kind of, so yes, white privilege exists in our communities, definitely. So even then, of course, now the white Muslim woman people may not question her religiosity, but they'll still marry her, right? But the thing that again, the point of this exercise is, so when we did the exercise and we triangulated everybody, Black Muslim women were the ones who, because the axes we used were religious authority and authenticity. So whether or not if you said something about the religion, people would believe you, and whether or not people would presume you were Muslim, right? And Black Muslim women had the least authority and authenticity. This was true across the board. And I've done it like 3 different times, and this was true. And so, but the point of this exercise for the class is to understand how we triangulate privilege in our own community, but also how does that privilege contribute to increasing somebody's vulnerability to premature death. So if we know, right, that outside of our community, for example, Black women, right, have these particular kind of vulnerabilities, and then inside of our community we continue to marginalize them, then, okay, yeah, sorry. So that was a long way of answering, so. I think this one, right, she had her hand up, yeah.
Hello, hi. I had a question about, I guess, the tension in the relationship between Black Muslims and Black Christians, in the sense that I'm from a majority Christian country. Muslims are, according to the census, 1% of the overall population.
All right.
And being a convert, that also means a lot of people, just don't really know a lot about my religion, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find in my community back home is this idea that, I guess, being a convert and becoming a Muslim, you're all woke and everything is wrong with your world before, and now you found the truth, right?
Okay.
And what that oftentimes means is something's wrong with Christians and everything about them and everything they do and this and that and all these different things.
Right.
So they're the terribly bad people and we are the terribly good people, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed that in myself, there's this attitude of condescension towards Black Christians. And, you know, coming here and being in a more diverse environment and being exposed to more Muslims and just coming to the realities that Muslims are people too. I believe that Islam is perfect, Muslims are not, and to understand that, you know, the same issues I may find with Black Christians, the same thing can be within Black Muslims. How do you think that we because they have their part, but I'm more concerned about what I can do and what we can do as Black Muslims to really, really engage Black Christians in a non-condescending way? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. It's funny because, you know, my grandmother who passed in May was Christian, you know, although my mother disagrees now, but that's a different story. Anyway, right? But like, it's like I've always had Christian family. And so, and I think I missed the fights because I was too young, right? So when my mother converted to Islam, and if there were fights, I missed it because I wasn't alive. And then when I was born, you know, whatever, right? You know, that kind of thing. So so I say that to say that my answer to the question is colored, right? Because that hasn't been my experience, right? My experience, like, you know, my Christian family, my high school, you know, those are my girls, you know what I mean? So I don't really have that experience, but I think I know what you're talking about, right? And you probably can actually answer this question better than I can. But I think perhaps one suggestion I could offer, right, is perhaps looking at the ways in which Muslims with Christian family interact with them, right? Which might be instructive for other people, right? Because, you know, when when your mother or your brother or your cousin or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, people get married. I mean, they're family. This is our lives, right? We don't share religious tradition. We have some differences there, but that doesn't prevent us from having really close and deep relationships with each other. And so maybe the model, right, is Black Muslims with Black Christian family, and how do they interact with each other as a way to kind of figure that out.
Thank you. Just a comment and then just two short questions. As a French Muslim, the Black American experience has been extremely important in the sense that it helped us understand ourselves, understand our position and our struggle in a society which does not name race, so which is even more problematic. My first question is, what do you think, how do you see the prospect for the relationship between Black Muslim and non-Black Muslim in the context of Trump, under Trump, in the sense that, I mean, we know that the representation of Islam in the US has been dominated by non-Black Muslims, at least after the 60s. And so now that Trump has a clear anti-brown agenda and that he kind of associates Islam with brown Middle Eastern, I almost want to ask, is there an opportunity for Black Muslims to reclaim the public image of Islam, especially knowing that they have more legitimacy being indigenous? So that's my first question. And my second question is on what Thurman Jackson defined Black Orientalism. And for those who don't know, the kind of idea that, you know, Islam and Africanness are conflictual. Have you experienced that, and how do you face it?
Right. Okay. Let me answer that one first and go back. So I'll tell a story. So I was, so a friend of mine, again, sort of, well, I guess they're not Christian. They practice kind of like, I guess, traditional African, sort of Africana diaspora religion. And there was a Kwanzaa program, so I went to the Kwanzaa program at his house, and we were doing a quiz. It was like, name an African language. And I was like, Arabic. And they were like, huh? And, you know, and I think that, and of course that, you know, that's part of that kind of Black Orientalism. And I'm, you know, and it's kind of like, well, how long does a language have to be in Africa for it to be African, Like, I don't know. I'm just like, it's been people speaking Arabic in Africa for a really long time. So, like this is kind of thing, right? So I think I've experienced it in these kind of ways, kind of these small ways, right? Kind of like little, just, kind of slights here or there. I think we had, actually on Sapelo, we did something on this, specifically around this issue of Islam and racism. We did a couple of pieces on this because of the ways in which, because yes, Arab Muslims did come to Africa and did enslave people. Yes, fact. Like, this is not, okay, but the sort of the broader questions around sort of Islam as a religion, we think it's sort of a little more complicated than that, right? So I think that yes, I've experienced that, and my response to that is, I think, just to kind of assert, because even when I teach, because I've taught African American studies, right? And this also happened with religion, right? It was like they teach, like, even this idea of traditional African religion, right? And it's like, okay, but like Christianity has been in Africa since like the first, this is like thousands, millennia, right? And so whether or not a particular kind of religion or tradition is also in that space. And then the people, and I feel like the people who practice this, and I'm not from the continent immediately, right? So I don't know, but I feel like the people who practice Christianity or Islam in particular on the continent feel like it is theirs. They don't feel like it's an imposition per se, right? So I think part of the way that I respond to that, I suppose, is more anthropologically, in terms of sort of questioning at what point do we begin to tell these stories? And at what point do we say, okay, this is the beginning point, this makes something authentic and it doesn't? And also to speak to, I think, the experiences of people who live those identities as well. And then lastly, I think that's it, just to kind of continue to sort of like push that, because I think it's important. Because I do think questions of sort of purity and origins and the fetishization of them are sort of products of white supremacy. I do. So even when people are trying to claim a kind of purity around Africa, which fossilizes the continent too, which is deeply problematic, I think is actually a product of white supremacy, even though they're trying to sort of undo it. So I'll stop there with that. Opportunity, right? Trump. That's a difficult question, I think, to answer, in so much as that I feel, one of the things that I argue about thinking about Muslims in the contemporary moment is thinking about them under sort of two frameworks in terms of dealing with the state. So thinking of them under the framework of surveillance, so the ways in which you're targeted as other, right, and as an enemy sort of the state, but also thinking of them in the framework of multiculturalism, in which you're targeted as an example of inclusion and how wonderful the state is. And non-Black Muslims quite easily fit both of those frames, right? Why? Because the racialized non-Black Muslim is an immigrant. So their immigrant status makes them scary and potentially dangerous, and the immigrant status says, oh, look, we're a country of immigrants. Anyone can make it here, right? And again, the Black Muslim troubles that, because they don't have that status, and you can't tell that story. And the story that the state tells about Black people is one of sort of incorporation, right? The Black struggle is an American struggle, up from slavery narratives, all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm not sure that Black Muslims can, we can create our own space, obviously, but in terms of like a way in which sort of outside the community people want to hear that, I'm not totally confident that there's a space for that, because of these kind of overarching narratives that support state power that can have to reproduce themselves. So so I'm like yeah, because one of the things I had talked about, I wrote like a little piece on, is that in July there was like Mahershala Ali was on the cover of GQ magazine, and Halima Aden, who's a Somali American Black Muslim woman, was on the cover of Allure, right? And it's like Black Muslim on the cover of like mainstream magazines. Like, I gotta write about that, whatever, right? And this was kind of my question, like, is this a sign of something different happening, Like, is that what's going on here? And I'm not sure. I think, because both in terms of sort of the state, but also Hollywood, news media, like this idea of the Muslim as an immigrant, like even organizing, like there's this group, and I won't name them, right? But there's this term people use, it's called like massa, which is deeply problematic. I'm like, massa, okay, right? But it's like Muslim, Arab, South Asian, American, something like that, right? And it's a framework people are using to organize around these communities because they are connected, right? I mean, they are connected, yes. But it's like, but black stuff don't really fit in that framework. And you're kind of like, but I don't, you know, so, and that's people who are trying to be allies of the community. So, I mean, so if they're sort of stuck to that, you know, I just kind of feel, you know, I don't know. But go to www.sapolosquare.com and you can have access to all the kinds of images and things that you want to hear about Black Muslims. That's what we do at Sapolo. But in terms of the broader framework, I think there's much more investment in Muslim as an immigrant narrative, as well as Black Muslim as unorthodox Muslim narrative, right? Because also what happens is if you delegitimize the Islam of Black Muslims, then you make them fringe, and you delegitimize their kind of like radical potential in broader community. So I'll stop there because I'm going on, but yeah, there were other people. I think this guy is in the back here. Yeah.
Hello. My question was, because so many forms of oppression are codependent, you can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other. When it comes to Muslim men, how do you think we should convince them that if you want to get rid of white supremacy, Arab supremacy, you also have to be concerned about patriarchy, sectarianism, and et cetera, et cetera?
Right. That is a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked.
I don't want to stretch the question, but like
it's more. Okay, sorry.
Last summer, I had went to the Black Muslim Psychology Conference.
Yes.
And they had a workshop.
Shout out to Muslim Women's Foundation. Yeah.
They had a workshop on domestic violence, and you had a lot of imams that said a lot of good, productive things, but then you also had a lot of imams that said a lot of counterproductive things, and they wouldn't recognize it. And these were like primarily African American imams. So while they were saying dismissive things, throwing women under the bus, they were throwing primarily African American women under the bus.
Right.
And you understand that African American women, Black American women of displaced ethnicities are like the fulcrum of anti-Blackness and misogyny in America. And it's like these are the same men that are, we quote Malcolm X, that the most, how does it go? What did he say? Who watched Lemonade? Y'all heard it. What did he say? The most oppressed, was it the Unprotected,
oh gosh.
woman in America is the Black woman, all that. Yeah. It's like you'll regurgitate that.
Oh,
When we call
glasses.
it out.
No one told me I had on glasses, sorry.
When we call it out to you, you kind of like act like white people when it comes to white fragility. So it's like.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation about this with two people that I love, two Black Muslim men that I love dearly.
I probably know them.
And I was trying to articulate to them, right, the problem with patriarchy and how it intersects. And one person, his response to me was like, oh, that's wonderful. He's like, yeah, I get it. He's like, now you need to like, so he had two things. He said, one, he was like, but now we need a new language because feminism is so polarizing. And then he was like, and then you develop that and then you can come teach us. And I was like, hold up, wait a minute, right? I'm the person I'm the oppressed party and I got to do all this work to teach you and this kind of thing. I'm like, well, you got it, go get your boys. It's like we tell white people, right? Like, it's like, you want to know what to do under Trump? Go get your people. It's really simple. You know, go get your people. So the same thing with men, right? I think, right, the answer to that question is that Black Muslim men who recognize, right, so who recognize how patriarchy intersects with white supremacy and these systems and how it holds our communities down, you know, who recognize that, they need to go and tell their boys and work with them. And that's your job, right? It's uncomfortable, but you know what's uncomfortable? Being subjected to white supremacy and patriarchy. You know what I mean? Again, right? So it's like there was this article, was it very straight brothers? They were like, straight Black men are the white people of the Black community, right? And I said something like that similar, and people got really offended, right? And it's like, I'm like, but see, you acting just like white people, right? Because I point out your privilege, and you're like dismissive. What happens? Because this happened to me. So they get defensive, then they dismissive, and then they cut you off. Like, this is what happens. This happened to me multiple times, right? You bring it out, and this is what happens. And so my response to the question is that the work of getting them to that space is the work of Black Muslim men to Black Muslim men, men to men relationships. You know, we can support from a distance, but that is the work that has to be done there. So, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with you, and thank you so much for bringing to light all these issues. I want to hear your point of view a little bit more on the experience of not dismissing white convert experience too, because as our previous guest mentioned a few points, I would say that my personal experience as a white convert also within the communities, I am underprivileged. I am not considered authoritative. I'm not considered traditional enough. And I'm also a religious educator, so I'm dismissed very easily as well. So my status is one of being a token for truth claims, right? And being utilized to kind of promote whatever, you know, topic a community wants to promote, and they use me as a mouthpiece. But in terms of being really accepted, that's never happened in my time as a convert. So I want to hear your point of view on that as well, and not to dismiss the pain that that's caused me and my children as well, because as I grow and as a Muslim, and as I try to educate my children within the community and create community, there were constant barriers, and there still are. For example, I just met with a religious leader in the community just the other night to talk about where I am with my work and so forth. I got dismissed. I got offered a substandard position and so forth. So, and that's after 20 years of working in the community, right? So I just want to hear your opinion on that and a little light to that experience as well. Please.
Yeah. So I can't speak, I'm not a white Muslim, so I can't
Obviously.
speak to that. But I am a Black and Latina Muslim, and they dismiss all the time, right? I'm a woman, I mean, all the time. So I understand that pain, right? I understand the pain of sort of seeing a community, feeling you're a part of it, and then being dismissed, right? I think that pain is real. I also think that pain is complicated, right? Because on some level, right, even the tokenization for some people is a privilege, right? That they even put you out there, that they even want to put you out there. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's completely. It's like, I know what it is. It's complete. Like, oh, hey, look, we have white Muslims, and we're modern and we're progressive, and I got that, right? But then they put us in the back somewhere, right? So it's like, it's this kind of complicated way in which this is working, right? And so I think part of it. So I guess, one, yes, I think that this is I think it's complicated, and then it's also complicated by just what whiteness means in our society, right? And so. What is the relationship between the kind of exclusions a white Muslim might experience within a Muslim community and the kind of advantages and privileges the white Muslim might experience outside the Muslim community? And how can we hold those two things together at the same time? Because that is part of the experience, right? And so, yes, I guess I don't know if I'm answering the question. I guess you asked me what I thought. Oh, yeah, right, so I answered the question. So I think then that we have to hold those two things together, right? We cannot dismiss, sort of wholly dismiss, kind of feelings of exclusion or pain associated with that a white Muslim might experience, but we also can't sort of negate or act as if white privilege is still not operative within and outside the community at the same time. So we have to be able to kind of hold those things at the same time, because ultimately what we're trying to do is, once we know what's going on, we want to do something about it, right? And we want to do something about it to everyone's benefit, not one group over the other, right? So I think for me, it's like holding that at the same time is really important. So that, yeah. There's someone here. Oh, I'm sorry. Oops.
How you doing? I'm a student over at Columbia University. I'm actually going for my master's right now, and I'm studying activism and social change through communication. And I first got acquainted with the fight for oppression when I first read The New Jim Crow, which looks at the African American incarcerated in America. And ever since then, I've been trying to have these conversations with some of my friends, and I feel as though a lot of us younger people, either we're too caught up in what we got going on that we don't really care, or a lot of people just aren't really interested in hearing about it. Last year when the whole national anthem protest started in the NFL, I found out that I lost a lot of friends about it just because they were so caught up with the act of taking a knee and not the actual message, which is the racial injustice that go on. So real quick, I know that you're into hip hop, and I use this quote by Tupac Shakur, in this country, a black man only has 5 years we can exhibit maximum strength, and that's while you're young and you're still strong. Because once you turn 30, it's like they take the heart and soul out of a black man in this country, and if you don't want to fight anymore. And if you don't believe me, you can look around. You don't see no loudmouth 30-year-olds around. So I'm still in my 20s. I'm 26, so.
He's like, I got 4 years left. I'm about to be as loud as possible. Yeah.
So while I still have time to hit 30, I was just wondering, what would be some advice you can give a young black male or young black person in general about having these conversations about fighting oppression?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my first piece of advice is to keep having them, right? Don't stop having them, because I think people resist for a lot of different reasons. I think it can feel really overwhelming because it is, what we're up against. I think that we're also not educated well, right? So because we're not educated well about what's happening, it's hard for you to even sometimes you don't even, you can't even, it's like you almost misinterpret your own experience, right? Because it's like, I know this, but I don't, this kind of thing. So I think, one, I guess I'm mentioning that to say that sometimes I think people sort of write off young people as kind of apathetic and they don't care and this kind of thing. And I think those feelings of apathy and not caring are really kind of, one, our fault of people who are older than them, right? Because we haven't sort of given them the kinds of things that they would need to to know enough to feel strong enough to say, I can do something about this. Because I think that's what happens. Like, you see something going on and it's like, I don't know what to do. I'm gonna just watch Love and Hip Hop. And no shade to Love and Hip Hop, But you can watch Love and Hip Hop, but you also need to get, do something else, right? And so I think, one, I would say, one is, I guess, to keep doing it with your friends and the people around you. And then also, I don't know if you're part of an organization, but I would say become a part of an organization, like whatever the issue is that you really want to work on. Like, so you read the new Jim Crow, so maybe it's like mass incarceration is your issue, or prison abolition, or whatever, and join an organization, because you also need like a squad, right? who's gonna, so you don't give up, right? You know what I mean? And so I think, and then if you're in this organization and you guys are doing stuff, you can invite your friends to it. And some of them may come, some not. You never know. The things that kind of stick with people, there's one thing they saw, and then 10 years from now, they're like, oh my God, this kind of thing, right? So I think keep doing what you're doing. Join an organization so you can be in like-minded company, and then you can create activities and events and these kind of things that you can sort of bring people to. And I would say, yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah. Yes. Look at that. Yeah. You're right.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your talk and your work and Sapello and Twitter and all the things. I learned a lot. I was just going to ask if you could expand on that final point you had about not erasing kind of the viewpoint of Black Muslims.
Not erasing
kind of Black Muslims from like a discourse and from, like working on Islam myself. I feel like I've internalized it, like one can't be anti-racist and still be anti-Black. Or kind of this other point of like, no one's free until we're all free. So kind of like trying to call attention to the most marginalized sort of positions, even if I don't necessarily share them. So if you could expand a little bit
on that. Although I feel like you did a really lovely expansion right there. I guess, yeah, let me see, how would I expand on that? So I suppose part of me bringing that up is because I wanted to acknowledge the frustration that Black Muslims, the frustration and the pain that Black Muslims feel by being erased by people who are supposed to be their community. So that's one thing. I wanted to acknowledge that that is real, and that it's a problem. So that was one thing. I think the other thing is that I guess I'm also asking or thinking about how non-Black Muslims, how do we get, so similar to the question that was asked earlier about Black Muslim men and privilege, is like, how do we get non-Black Muslims to sort of recognize their privilege, sort of in Muslim communities and outside? And, you know, I've had similar conversations with non-black Muslims who are kind of like, well, I'm not white, who act like white people when you talk to them about their privilege, right? They're like, oh, I'm not white. You're like, right, right? And then you're like, you get your homegirl to go talk to her people because you're like, I can't do it, right? That kind of thing. So I think one is sort of, you know, acknowledging that experience, but also really asking non-black Muslims who have platforms, right, to use those platforms in ways. You know, what did I say? I had some saying that people really liked on Twitter. Yes, right? You don't need to be a voice for the voiceless, just pass the mic. Like, pass the mic, for goodness sake. Just pass it, you know? Like, pass it. you know, this kind of thing. And like, I've seen, and I guess I probably shouldn't call out specific things because that probably wouldn't be the prophetic example. But like, I've seen like things, like I was teaching this class and we were looking at this one particular kind of media thing that was done. And it's like, it was a kind of a series of videos that was created that was meant to really, I think, speak to a non-Muslim audience and challenge their perception of Muslims, right? And there were like 2 black Muslims in it. And it was a series of videos, and then they had videos in which they were like multiple people, and the videos where it was a single story, right? And I watched it with my class. I had to be like 20 of these things, right? And of the 20, of the multiple people, ones, there were like 3 or 4, and the black Muslims were in there. They had little things to say. And then of the like 15 single stories, there was 1 black Muslim. And this is an effort by people who are raised in this country, who are claiming to sort of try to change perceptions. And when I saw it, I was like, I can't believe I'm watching this. I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, I'm like, I want, like smoke is coming out of my ears, right? Because it's like, y'all just like white people. Like, seriously. I'm like, I like, what is going, like, because you got the token here and you say you about this and you're not really about it, you know, and people who are involved in it. And so you have the people who created that who are Muslim, and then you have the people who are involved in that, right? And it's like, well, what are you, like, you know, my friend was telling me she was at a talk recently that was about the rise of Islamophobia. And she was like, there were 3 speakers, none of them were black, 2 were Muslim. I think both actually were Arab Muslims and Arab American, well, actually, the Arab American Muslims, and one, I think, was a South Asian woman who wasn't Muslim, who were on this kind of panel. And one of the Arab American people spoke about the importance of Malcolm X and the black Muslim experience to understanding Islamophobia. But I was like, did somebody ask him, so why did you say, how can the black people on this panel with me? You know, like, where are the black, like, I don't, you know, and so there's a way in which there's like, okay, if you want to talk the talk, walk the walk, right? And inclusion is not difficult. You just have to be intentional. That's all. If you need suggestions, I made a list at one conference, at Muslim conference, I made a list of black Muslim women. I have lists, you know, what expertise do you need? You know, we have that. And not just to have them one person, but to really sort of be like, okay, this experience is important. And because one of the things I say in Muslim Cool is like, you cannot understand what it means to be Muslim in this country if you don't understand blackness. And if you don't understand, you just don't, whether you're black or not. Like, your experience is fundamentally shaped by blackness, the black experience, the black Muslim experience. Punto, like it is. And so you are walking around not really even knowing yourself. You don't have knowledge of self yet. And the more you continue to erase and to repeat the erasures of white supremacy, imperialist white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, the more you continue to do that, you're deluding yourself, and you're not actually helping us, but hurting us. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, we are. Okay. Rarely does.
And so it really takes some kind of jolting the system, and that goes for race and gender. And so, you know, as a white professional or as an Arab Muslim, you should really make conscious decisions about where you'll show up. And if people don't have diversity present, you should let them know explicitly that you're not showing up because it's not there. And it should be there more than in a token fashion.
Right. And I get that some people eat this way. I get it, right? But I'm trying to eat too, right? You know, and like this, and what is my friend Marguerite Hill from Muslim Arc, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative? She talks about this. great organization, right? Shout out to Muslim Arc. And she's like, this is scarcity mindset that people are operating under, right? There actually is enough for all of us. There is. So yeah. Well, I just saw her hand, but I don't know. So let's go there and then we'll okay. I'm really bad at this job. Sorry. No, I'm overstepping. I should let you do it. No. I'm going to not do it anymore. Yeah.
So I'll make my question short. I was wondering if you think the fight starts within our own communities first, or do you think it's a priority to kind of put up a strong front and fight what's going on in our society, take care of our communities later, or should we perfect our communities before taking on?
Which fight?
I would say many fights, particularly on race and like fighting anti-Blackness, racism, and colorism within the Muslim community.
Right. So I don't think you can sort of fight anti-Blackness outside the Muslim community if you don't do it inside the Muslim, because then you're a hypocrite. It's like, what are you saying? Like, you're like, oh, and then the people look at your message and they're like, so, and they're really not oppositional. There's like a symbiotic kind of thing happening here, right? And this is the idea of liberation as a journey, right? And perfecting our character and trying to sort of embody sort of these principles of liberation. This is what that's about, right? So I think, yes, I don't think it's an either or this first. I think it's more like doing that is doing that, right? If our communities if our communities eliminate sort of anti-Muslim racism anti-Black racism within them, then we have one less space that is holding white supremacy up, which is an effect, right, on that.
So I should have prefaced this, but what prompted my question was that a lot, like a saying that goes around a lot in the Muslim community is that we need to kind of like hide our own problems and put up a strong front in front of like the rest of the community. And so it's, at least to me, my experiences have always people have always said to fight what's going on outside and then to look into your own community.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess to me it always was presented as an either or.
Right, it's like, don't front. Like, don't front. I mean, because you're not fooling anyone, to be honest. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, so don't front. It's it's sort of, if you having a strong community is because we have strong relationships to each other, because we care about each other, we love each other, we're committed to each other. That's our strength. Not having some kind of front that we're strong. So if that's what people want, that's what you invest your time in, as opposed to, trying to sort of put on a good face for sort of white people, because that's really who we're talking about when we're talking about giving a front, right? Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. So this isn't really a fully formed question, but just a thought that occurred to me while we were talking about tokenizing white Muslims. And I want to know what you think, or just any thoughts you have about the way immigrant Muslim communities kind of, I wouldn't say, I don't even know what the word is, but have an obsession with Black Americans who convert in jail. They just think that, I think it just has something to do with the way I think the girl who asked the question left, but the way they come to this country and they learn about Blackness through white supremacy, and they're like, Black people in this country are immoral and overly sexual and just all these horrible things, but then they go to jail and they're reformed, and if they used to be drug dealers in their past life, they see Islam as the right way, and this is amazing, but we don't really care about mass incarceration. But
okay, I got you. Okay, now I get. Okay, I was
how do we?
I see what you're saying. So this, okay, I see.
I guess, what do we do about this weird narrative that comes out?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Okay. She's like, I think it's there's a Malcolm X kind of story, right? They're all Malcolm. They went, and then it came out, and it's great. But then you're but then there isn't this parallel investment or concern about mass incarceration and the issues that it poses, right? And the question is, how do I think we can get non-Black Muslim communities to stop doing that?
Or just I don't know, what do you see this narrative
Well, like, so for
unfolding?
example, a friend of mine, she's part of this organization called New Wave Muslim Initiative. It's called NUMI. And they're based in the DC, Virginia area. And the community is primarily Shia, and they're primarily non-Black. And so she's been doing these programs. So they did a program on, from Muharram last year. They did a program on some of these issues, and this year they're doing a program on, they're using, you're going to show the 13th, the documentary by Ava DuVernay, and bring some people in and talk about it. And so I think that's part of what's happening. So, and she, you know, she's really conscious, so she's like, we don't want this, we want people to sort of know, they have to be educated. She's like, I'm educating my community about this issue. And I want them to see how it connects to their issue, right? Because when we talk about for prisons, for example, right, one of the things that clearly people talk about is that, you know, prisons and detention centers, right, are part of the same structure of mass incarceration, right? And so people who are being detained because of Muslim bans, you know, sort of immigration, all this kind of stuff, like the same sort of logic that does that is the logic that's locking up Black and brown men. You know, I mean, this is happening. So how do you make, so part of it is not seeing the connection, right? I think a lot of stuff is about people not seeing how this particular issue is connected to their own experience. And there's a lot of incentive not to see that. But so I guess I would suggest that people who are from those communities, who have a sense of these issues, you know, do the work of educating and trying to get people to sort of see. That's hard work, it's gonna take a really long time. But yeah, that's my thing. Yeah. So there was, oh, okay, yeah, you spoke already, so yeah, we'll do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Danielle, and I'm an organizer, and I'm Christian, but I've organized in an African American masjid, and then with younger Arab Muslims. And so, going back to her question there, I've heard this narrative, not necessarily from either group, but from other folks that say, hey, don't bring the anti-Blackness discussions. I mean, that's important, but, you know, they're dealing with their own issues right now.
Who's they in that sense?
Arab Muslims are dealing with all these issues right now.
Right.
Don't compound it by bringing this conversation. So I'm curious, where have you seen examples of conversations around anti-Blackness in the Muslim community, in the Arab Muslim communities, or in the immigrant Muslim communities?
Right, okay. So one thing I want to say, because I mentioned this earlier, and I want everyone to stop doing this, and I'm not picking on you.
Oh,
okay?
that's fine.
But I want everyone to stop using indigenous immigrant, please. Just stop, right? Say who you mean and mean who you say, okay? There are indigenous Muslims. There are autochthonous to this land, right? We don't want to erase them, right? So what Native American Muslims, by sort of using this term indigenous to describe Black people, just say Black, 'cause that's what you mean. Now, some of us Black people are indigenous too, but that's not what we're talking about when we use the term, right? So that's one thing. And also immigrant. You know, my father is an immigrant from Panama, right? That's not who you're talking about when you talk about immigrant Muslims, right? So say what you say, mean what you say. So I'm not saying, but just in general, just as a PSA to the world. That's that's the thing.
No, thank you.
So where have I seen this? So like the first thing that came to my mind, and it's not really a Muslim organization, but they do a lot of work with South Asian communities who include Muslims, is DRUM, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving. And I know they've done work and workshops in their community around sort of like anti-Blackness and linking again sort of the struggles of sort of South Asian immigrants and Black communities. So that's one place that I've seen that. Again, we mentioned Muslim ARC, and Muslim ARC is not like based in one particular community, but they do trainings. So like if you have this issue in your community around anti-Blackness and all these different kind of racial issues, and you're looking for help on how to kind of have this kind of conversation in your community, Muslim ARC is a great resource. I've also seen some individuals sort of like, someone like a colleague of mine, Khalid Beydoun, right, who's a professor of law, I think it's Mercy Law School in Detroit, and he's an individual, but he also, I think, is an advisor for Muslim ARC, but he is Arab American who works on anti-Muslim racism a lot and also making these connections, right, between these struggles. Who Who else is there? I think also for me, a lot of the hip hop that I do. So I just had a book party in LA, and so a good friend of mine, Omar Effendum, who's Syrian American, lives in LA, making these connections. The Narcissist, he's Iraqi Canadian, making these connections. So I feel like how artists and activists are making these connections. And I'm sure, and I'm probably blanking, I'm sure there are other sort of communities and spaces that are doing that. I know actually in Chicago, there's an organization that isn't Muslim run, but is Muslim engaged. So this one is called the Arab American Action Network. And I know they've been doing some work around kind of like police brutality and linking between, because the majority of the folks in that community are Palestinian. And so kind of making those links that way. Yeah, so ethnic, because you're saying ethnic specific, because there are other institutions, even like this one institution that I worked with in Chicago, EMAN, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, but they're not an ethnic kind of specific space, right? They're kind of a multi-ethnic space. But, so those are some of the things I've seen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I think that's it, right?
Yeah, so first and foremost, we want to thank Dr. Abdul Khabeer for being here and giving of her time and fascinating talk. So let's thank her.
And thank you.
And I also want to thank the program assistant Alay Saeed of ISJIE and all the volunteers that are here tonight and the facilities and admin staff that help set up the events and run them. I also want to impress upon those of you who come from outside of the Union community to really stay in touch with Union, because this is a place where there's a lot of interesting things going on, and especially conversations around pressing intersectional topics. So whether that's academic or just in terms of the public programming, please go on the website, get involved, get hooked up with the calendar and the mail list. The most important thing is there's coffee over there and cookies. And so I don't know if anyone drinks coffee at this time of day. I do, but so help yourself. And there's books in the back. So please, if you've purchased a book, you get your button, maybe sign.
So should I just go back there if I want to sign?
If you want to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And so mingle and we're around. Thank you so much. Thank you again.